One of the first things that we are going to cover in this chapter is why are we studying communication? And I think it seems almost a very natural thing for you to do now. When we are born, the moment we are born, we are surrounded with language and communication. We're taught to communicate from a very young age with any first type of language that we hear, whether it be English or Spanish or Chinese, whatever makes sense to us, whatever environment we grow up in, we are instantly thrown into a communication environment as babies all the way into adulthood, all the way into now. So why are we studying something that we've pretty much done our entire lives? And so really what we're doing is we're taking a step back and we're looking at it from a social scientific point of view, a theoretical point of view. How can we understand communication from a theoretical lens so that we can build up our skills as competent communicators? And this first chapter really helps us get our feet wet with that endeavor. So why do we communicate? The biggest thing about why we communicate is that it really fulfills our major needs as human beings. And you'll see in the textbook that there are 4 needs that are covered. The first one are physical needs, identity needs, social needs, and practical needs. And I'm going to go through these right now. So the first are physical needs. We need to communicate in order to express what we need, whether that be food, whether that be shelter, whether that be something like being able to communicate in a job interview and sustain our lives and sustain ourselves. Communication addresses those bare minimum physical needs that we have in order to survive. The second layer to that is communication also fulfills our identity needs. A lot of scholars have found, and this is where our discipline crossbreeds a little bit with anthropology and sociology, in that communication is noted as the primary way that we find out who we are. How do you know who you are? You know who you are because your parents gave you a name, right? They give you a name and then they call you their daughter or their son or their child. And by using those words and those labels, you learn that, oh, these are my parents, this is my name, this is my relationship to them, here are my siblings. And that is all done through communication. And of course, it doesn't only focus on your family identity, it focuses on your cultural identity, your social identity, your work identity, your identity with your friends. All of that cannot be possible without others communicating with you and you communicating with others what your identity is to them and who they are to you. The next layer of that is social needs. People have found that if you are spouses, if you are friends, if you are communicating with your family, those who communicate in a healthy, regular manner with family, friends, romantic partners tend to report higher satisfaction with those relationships. Communication really helps us practice our need to be social. We're very social creatures as human beings. It's a natural tendency that we have. And communication is the primary way that we are social and we engage in social activities. And the last one is practical needs. Simple things, the textbook even mentions simple things like telling your barber that you want a haircut a certain way, or telling your server at a restaurant that you want your food a certain way, or communicating with others and expressing practical day-to-day activities and needs is a major function of communication. And it really wraps up this whole idea of how we really can't survive or even go a single day without communicating with others successfully. So now that we've covered those 4 needs, we're going to go on and move into understanding a little bit more about communication, specifically the model of communication and how it has evolved over time to meet those 4 needs that we have just talked about. So human communication is quite a complicated process. We tend to oversimplify it in our heads. And it's quite easy to do that with something that you've been doing your whole life. You've been communicating your whole life, but I'm sure that many of you have found over time that it is a little bit harder to do than we think it is. We have all gotten into conflicts, misunderstandings, or otherwise have experienced other problems because we have communicated in a way that was not appropriate to a certain situation. And so we're going to study 2 major models that were the theoretical foundations of communication. The first model that we are going to study is the linear model. So the metaphor I have for you here on the slide, you can see my cursor, is that it resembles an archer shooting a message at a target. So think of it as I write a letter to someone, a pen pal in China, and then I send it over to China, and then I don't really hear a response right away. That is very indicative of that linear one-way model. You don't get immediate feedback from the other person or persons that you're communicating with, and it's very much, there's my target, here's my message, and I'm sending it. Very, very simplistic. We have found that this model doesn't really help us fully understand how communication plays a role in developing our relationships, which is basically the theme of this whole course, right? How does communication play a role in the development and the satisfaction of our relationships? The one model that does help us understand the more complex processes of communication is this later model right here. The metaphor I have for you is a tennis game. So instead of up here where we have an archer shooting a message, it's a one-way street. Here, these later, more modern models treat it like a tennis game where there's a constant back and forth between the persons involved in the communication interaction. Senders and receivers are expected to exchange messages simultaneously, meaning at the same time. How do they do this? They respond with both verbal and nonverbal feedback. One example that I like to give to my students in my face-to-face classes, and I'm sure a majority of you have taken a class, a face-to-face class, and in that face-to-face class, your professor probably lectured. And during lecture, it might seem that I'm the only one talking to my students. So my students are there listening, they're taking notes, and I'm the only one in the interaction talking. However, my students are communicating to me as well, even though they're not saying something. When my students are nodding or they're taking notes or they're finished taking notes and they put their pens down and they're listening, they're non-verbally communicating a lot to me. Those students who are nodding, who look confident, are telling me, hey, I understand what's going on. I understand this slide. We're totally good on this concept. Sometimes I can tell when a student doesn't fully understand something because they'll kind of tilt their head this way or they'll raise their hand to ask a question, or I can tell that they just look a little bit lost. That nonverbal communication is immediate feedback that I am getting, and it lets me know, hey, it looks like a majority of my students look a little confused about this particular topic. I should probably stop, take questions, or try to explain it again in a different way. So even though I may be the only one in the classroom talking, my students are communicating to me a wealth of information that I am using and responding back to, and that's the key. When I look at my students being confused or confident, that's going to determine my behavior throughout the lecture. If they look confident, I'm just going to move right through the lecture. If they look like they need a little bit more clarification, I'll slow my lecture down. And so these later models really help us understand the ways that immediate nonverbal feedback help us to modify any given communication interaction. I'm going to go ahead and show you a model of it right now, an actual drawn model of this tennis game idea. This picture is actually also available in your textbook. It's in a different color, but it's basically the same thing. And this is what we call the transactional model of communication. Whoa, I zoomed in too much. So you can see here that here's one communicator on one end, here's a communicator on the other end. And so I know that this model seems like quite a lot is going on. So let me go ahead and distill this for you right now. So like I said, here's our two communicators right here. Both of them send, receive, and assign meaning to the messages they're taking. What that means is that they're giving out messages, either verbal or nonverbal. They're receiving communication, either verbal or nonverbal, and they're assigning meaning to it. So back to my example of me taking notice of my students in my classroom. If I notice that my students look like this and they're raising their hand and they overall just seem like they need a lot more clarification on what I'm explaining, what they're doing is they're sending a nonverbal message. I'm taking in that nonverbal message and I'm assigning meaning to it. I'm assigning the meaning of, this head tilt and this hand up means, wait, I need more help. So that's me assigning meaning to it. I'm the one that is assigning meaning to it. So that's very key. These squiggly little yellow lines you see right here are noise, as they're labeled as such. And noise is anything that interferes with that communication process. So at any given time, when you are communicating with someone, that interaction is subject to noise. What that means is that there could be external factors that you can't control that end up affecting the way that the other person takes in your message. This could be literal noise. So, for example, you could be on the phone at a very, very busy party. And so the noise of that party is drowning out your conversation with the person on the phone. But noise can also mean other factors that are influencing your interaction. That could mean that I'm in a really bad mood right now, and I'm very hungry, and I'm very tired, and all of that is making it really hard for me to pay attention to this other person. That's also a source of internal noise. External noise could also deal with other issues that interrupt communications, such as barriers in language. So let's say you're speaking to someone with whom English is not their first language. You may or may not experience noise with that person in the sense that it may be harder for you to catch on to what they're saying. And likewise, it's hard for them to catch on to what you're saying because of that language barrier. So when we hear noise, when you see the word noise in our textbook and in the context of our class, remember that it doesn't just mean little noise like knocking. It can also mean noise such as anything that is psychological, internal, like I said, I'm in a bad mood, or I'm sad, or I'm hungry. It could be that kind of internal noise that is preventing me from fully taking a message in. It can also be external barriers such as language barriers or anything else that can prevent the other person from taking in your message. Sound good? Anytime we send a message, we send it through a channel. So you can see this little line right here. This blue line is your channel, and a channel is the mode or the way that you communicate your message. So one example of a channel could be a text message. One example could be a phone call. The channel that we're using right now is YouTube to communicate this lecture to you all. And so channels are very important because, as Marshall McLuhan said, he's a great scholar, he said that the medium is the message. What that means is that it's not just the message that is important, but it's also the way you send the message. So a student of mine was telling me once, one great example of why a channel matters is that one of her ex-boyfriends actually broke up with her through text message. And she wasn't so upset about the breakup. She knew it was coming, but she wasn't so upset about the breakup as she was the way that he did it, the channel that he chose to break up with her on. We all know that it's not appropriate to end a very serious relationship through a text message, right? And so that channel really changed the way that she perceived that whole experience. And I'm sure that if they had gotten together and talked about the relationship face to face and broke up that way, I'm sure she would have had a very different breakup experience versus getting a text very late at night, I'm breaking up with you. So channels are very important. And when we get into later chapters, this will become a definite issue because we'll be talking about social media and we'll be talking about the multitude of different communication channels that we have at our disposal now and how that's affecting not only our communication processes, but ultimately how that is affecting our relationships. Because remember, as I said at the beginning of this lecture, communication is the major way that we create, build, and maintain our relationships. So keep that in mind. Channels are very important. The last thing I'm going to cover today is you can see down here it says A's environment and B's environment. So A just stands for this person over here. B stands for this person over here. And what that means is that every single person that is interacting in a communication interaction comes with their own, I like to call it like baggage, right? So we are all really unique, wonderful individuals because we all have different life experiences. We're all from different cultural backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds. We've grown up in different places. So for me, I was born in Vietnam, but I grew up in Los Angeles, California. And so everything that you are, all of your life experiences, the identity that you have learned about yourself and built for yourself throughout your whole life is your environment. It's that baggage that you take in with you to every single communication process. That is so important because it colors the way you assign meaning to something. All right, super, super important to remember that, especially when we get into our next chapter of chapter 2, when we learn a lot about culture and where our cultural identity feeds into our communication process. But for the purposes of this model, it's very important to remember that every single person has an environment that they bring with them, okay? Another word you could use for that is perception. They have a set of perceptions or ideas of the world that they bring into the interaction with them, and that ultimately affects the interaction as a whole. You can see that there is overlap here. So typically between communication interactants, even though they have different perceptions, different experiences, different identities, they all ultimately can overlap in their environments because we all shared similar human experiences no matter where we come from. We know what it's like to feel emotion. We know what it's like to want to have a family or friends or have relationships with others. We all know what it's like to have dreams and hopes and aspirations. And so that is where that kind of overlap is that this process, while it recognizes that everybody has a different environment, it also recognizes that there is a sense of commonality that we can reach with one another through this process. So I know that was a lot, and that is a lot of squiggling lines and a lot of models, but this is such an important model for us to understand because it really sets the foundation for us to understand a lot of our later chapters on culture, on the self, where it comes from, on perception. So if you have any concerns or any more questions about this model, please do not hesitate to let me know in the future. Moving right along. So what do we get from this model? I always like to let my students know, okay, well, we covered something. We covered a model, we covered a theory, we covered an idea. And then I like to do, so what? Why do we care? So why in the world did I just spend so much time on the transactional communication model? And here are the 4 reasons for why we care about it. Here's my so what, right? So what? The first one is that we have to understand that sending and receiving are simultaneous. The initial linear one-way model of communication assumed that I talk, you listen, and then you talk, and then I listen. And that I'm not sending any messages while you're talking or vice versa. And we know that's not true. Oftentimes people send lots of nonverbal cues and other types of messages even when they're just listening. As you can see with my example with my students, when I'm lecturing in a face-to-face class, my students are sending me tons of nonverbal messages all the time. And so sending and receiving are simultaneous. They happen at the same time. The second most important thing that we learn from the transactional communication model is that meanings exist in and among people. Words don't have meaning. People imbue them with meaning. When you think about it, our language, the English language, and all of the languages that human beings have created are completely arbitrary, random symbol systems. What that means is that we decided to give names, to give words to certain objects, to our reality, ultimately, right? So for example, we decided that we were going to call this a phone, P-H-O-N-E, right? And so whenever I say phone, you think of this or something similar. But there's nothing in reality that says that this object has a direct relationship with P-H-O-N-E, phone. Right? So I think we can all agree, if I decided to change the name of this object, so let me say that I want to call it a floopy floppy from now on. It's no longer called a phone. We're going to call it a floopy floppy. And I have all of you agree, yeah, we should call it a floopy floppy. If we all have mutual agreement that that's what we want it to be called, well, that's its new name. But did changing the name of this object change what it is? No. So what that tells us is that the objects or our reality, our world around us has no meaning in and of itself. We're the ones that assign the words to the meaning. We're the ones that assign meaning to our world using words. Does that make sense? So The third thing that we have learned is that, as I covered in the model, environment and noise affect communication. So the person's perceptions, experiences, baggages, and any barriers to communication, the noise, will always influence a communication interaction no matter what. And ultimately, that pairs with our very last insight, which is that channels make a difference. Channels are incredibly important. As you guys know, taking an online class is probably very different from taking a face-to-face class, and your experience in taking this class is going to be very different from the experience of a student who's taking my class in a hybrid or from a student who's taking my class face-to-face. You might have experienced completely different learning communities, completely different learning processes. You might come out of this class a different way because of the channel that we're using to teach this class. So really important to remember that. Also, don't text people to break up with them. That's just rude. That's rude. Don't do that. So, one question that I have for you that I want you to think of: if you want to end a romantic relationship, think about how you would communicate that face-to-face, via email, and those differences. This is my go-to example for anyone who needs further clarification on why a channel is important. This is why. So always go back to this kind of hypothetical situation to get your mind going, to help you understand a little bit more about why that model, why channels are important. So let's go back to learning a little bit more. So now that we have covered our needs and how communication meets those needs, and we've also covered the transactional model of communication and why it's important, we're going to now move on to communication principles. What are the major foundational things about communication that you need to know in order to be successful? As we just covered, it's transactional, so that's based off those 4 principles that we just learned. So I'm gonna go ahead and go to the second bullet point right there. It is a process of mutual influence. What that means is that in any given interaction, how that person is communicating with you will influence how you respond, and also vice versa. The best example I have of this is meeting someone for the very first time. When you meet someone for the very first time, whether it's a possible new friend, a new coworker, you're on a blind date, and you're meeting that person for the very, very first time, it's always a little weird, right? Because you have to see, are you kind of my kind of people, or can we be friends, or what kind of relationship are we going to have? And it's a process of mutual influence, because when the other person is talking and there's something about them that you like, either you find them very funny or they're talking about interests that you're interested in as well, then you're going to amp up your game, right? You're going to get really excited, like, oh my gosh, you love Star Wars? I love Star Wars. Let's talk more about Star Wars. And so the fact that you chose to respond that, oh, this person likes Star Wars, I like Star Wars too, I'm going to bring up how much I like Star Wars, that is an example of how communication is a process of mutual influence. That person bringing up Star Wars influenced you to bring up Star Wars, and then when you bring up Star Wars, that influences them to maybe like you more and want to communicate with you more and want to have a longer conversation with you, because they're like, oh shoot, did we just become best friends? And it can also go vice versa, right? Sometimes you meet someone and you're like, I don't know if I like you for some weird reason, right? We've met at least one person where we're like, I don't know. And that is because of interdependent behaviors. And in communication, it's really important that in any healthy and thriving relationship that we have strong, healthy communication. And what that means is that you have to have interdependent behaviors. You have to have behaviors that match one another, that make sense with one another, and we'll build on that later on when we get to our chapters on relationships. Communication is uniquely created, meaning that you can never take it back, right? So the moment you say something, it is a unique piece of art, right? It's a message, like it's already out there, and you can't really take it back. And I think that we've grown up as children being like, oh, I take that back, and you can't really take anything back. And for those of you who have reflected on this aspect of the textbook, you, I hope, remember a time when you said something. It could have been a joke. It could have been something that you didn't mean to be hurtful to the other person, but it ended up being hurtful to them anyway. And you try to take it back, but in reality, you can't, because once it is said, and the impact is done. And so you can never undo or uncreate a communication interaction. That leads me to my next 3 points right here. Communication is intentional or unintentional. It is irreversible and unrepeatable. What that means is that you can intend or unintend to communicate. You can intend to say something to someone like, wow, I really like your outfit today. It looks wonderful. And you can choose to say that to that person. That's an intended message. However, you can also send out unintentional messages. We do this all the time with our clothing, and we don't even know it. The way that you dress, the way that you style your hair, the way that you have makeup or no makeup, what kind of, how you hold yourself with your posture in different contexts, unintentionally sends messages to people. One example I can give you is that I unintentionally communicate very often when I'm out in public. I look a lot younger than I really am. I don't look my true age. And so it's the thing about Asian people in my family. Like, we just look 12 forever. And then when we hit 60, we look 100. I don't know why. So I've accepted I'm just going to have this baby face forever. But I unintentionally communicate when I'm out in public because of this face. That I'm young. And so people treat me differently in different contexts because they assume that I am very, very young. This nonverbal communication right here, I don't mean it to look young. I don't want to look 12, but I look 12. And so there's nothing I can do about that. When I go to Vegas, you best believe I get my ID checked every time I walk 2 feet anywhere. It's quite common for that to happen to me. And so that is an unintentional way that you communicate. My other students have also talked about something called RBF, also known as resting bee face. And some of you may have it. I know sometimes I have it. It maybe depends on my mood. But for those of you who don't know, RBF refers to when someone has a relaxed face and they're just hanging out. But for whatever reason, non-verbally, they look like really upset, but they're really not that upset. That's just their resting face, right? That's just a natural way their face looks. But that can unintentionally send a message that you're upset, even though you're not really upset. So that's another way that communication can be intentional or unintentional. One key thing I want to point out, regardless of whether or not you meant to say something, whether it's intentional or not, the impact of that communication is still there. Like I said, I may not intend to have RBF where I'm looking upset, but it doesn't matter. Someone will look at my face, think I'm upset, and then react to that. So even though I didn't intend to look upset, the impact of that message was still sent out. Okay? So in sum, just because you didn't mean it doesn't mean that it didn't have impact. Very important. We'll talk about that throughout this whole class, I promise. Communication is irreversible, so like I said, it's very unique, and it is unrepeatable, meaning you can't redo a communication interaction over and over and over again. And that's because every single interaction is special and is unique. And I know for those of you who have been in long-term relationships or have just known someone for a very long time, you're like, what? Like, I've known my parents forever. Like, we always talk the same way to each other. The same manner, yes, but every single interaction that you have with your parents, every single interaction you have with a sibling, a significant other, your best friend, no matter how long you've known them, every single interaction is considered unique because you might be in a different mood that day. That affects your environment. You might be, and noise as well, you might be in a different place in your life, right? How you talk to your parents when you were a teenager probably isn't going to be the same way you talk to them as an adult or as an older adult, right? So while the relationship is still the same as parent and child, your interactions with your parents will continuously be unrepeatable and unique because you are changing, they are changing, time is changing, and every interaction is different. The last thing is that communication has a content dimension and a relational dimension. What that means is that communication has content, meaning that it has meaning to it. So if your boss says, hey, I want this report by tomorrow, he or she is saying, I want this task completed by tomorrow, right? That's the content of it. But it also has a relational dimension. So if your boss is like, hey, Susie, whenever you get a chance, I really would just love this report to get done. I know you're super busy, but I really would like it to get done as soon as possible, and I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much. So the content is the same. The idea of I need this report done by tomorrow is the same. But the way that I'm saying it relationally to you demonstrates that, hey, we're friends. I like you as a person. I get that you're busy. I don't want to be harsh with you right now. And I want us to have this nice, friendly relationship. You may or may not also have a boss that's like, I need this by tomorrow. Get it done. And then they just leave, right? And so, again, while the content is the same, they're still requesting something from you. Relationally, the way that the message is delivered differed. Which means that the type of relationship you have with your boss is different, right? And I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this with a myriad of different people in your lives, your instructors, your supervisors, your coworkers, your parents, your significant others. The way that you talk to someone really says a lot about your relationship with them. And the way they talk to you, right, the way they refer to you, the kind of words that they use to refer to you, the manner in which they speak with you, the tone in which they speak with you, really indicates a lot about what they think of you and your relationship. So, very important to think about both of those aspects. So, moving on. We are just going to roll. So, characteristics of interpersonal communication flows right into interpersonal relationships. So you can't have an interpersonal relationship without interpersonal communication. One-on-one in dyads, meaning two, you communicate with those that you want to maintain a relationship with. Imagine if you just suddenly stopped talking to your friends. You wouldn't really have a relationship with them, right? So interpersonal relationships actually share a lot of the same traits of interpersonal communication. You can see here that we have covered some of them already, uniqueness and interdependence. So I'm gonna skip these 2 bullet points and I'm gonna go down to these 2 right here to let you know. So uniqueness and interdependence, very similarly tied with how communication is unique and dependent on interdependent behaviors. But one key feature of an interpersonal relationship, what makes it an interpersonal relationship? Self-disclosure. One of the most awesome things about having an interpersonal relationship of any kind, so romantic partners, friendships, one-on-one relationships with coworkers, any of that, is that self-disclosure is a wonderful way to build and maintain that relationship. Self-disclosure is anytime you disclose or you share something about yourself. And that can range from very superficial things at first, but really self-disclosure is all about sharing things that are very in-depth, that maybe not the whole world knows about you, and things that you only really share with your friends, with your family, with people that you trust. And self-disclosure has to be reciprocal, meaning that if you share something about yourself with the other person, they have to share something about themselves with you, right? It'd be kind of weird if you would be the only one telling someone else your secrets or your dreams or your hopes or your career aspirations or your fears and your anxieties. Like, you're sharing all of this very personal stuff about yourself, and they're like, yeah, that's cool. And they don't say anything back to you, and they never ever share anything about themselves. You're not quite building that relationship. So self-disclosure has to be reciprocal, meaning that it has to be returned. Interpersonal relationships also feature intrinsic rewards, meaning that we like being in relationships. Like I said, it meets one of our needs. At the very beginning of this lecture, it all ties together. We learned about how communication really helps us fulfill that social aspect that we need. We're very social creatures. And one intrinsic reward of an interpersonal relationship is that we get the enjoyment of being social. We get the enjoyment of being in a relationship with someone. And when I say being in a relationship, I don't mean just romantic. I mean being friends with someone, having a strong relationship with your coworkers, whatever that may be. You get rewards from that. And I'm not talking just monetary rewards. I'm talking about internally, you feel good about having these relationships. They satisfy that social need for you. So, I'll Charlie Brown. Let's talk about communication misconceptions. We walk into our relationships thinking like I said at the beginning of this lecture, that communication is a little bit easier than it really is in reality. And so what we're going to do now that we have covered our needs and why we communicate, we've also covered our communication model. We've talked about why that model is important, and we then transition to talking about the different principles of communication and how they factor into developing our interpersonal relationships. So now we're going to dispel or cut out or just get rid of when I say Ms, M-Y-T-H-S, I can't say that word correctly, or misconceptions, meaning that we tend to think these 4 sentences right here are true and real, and in reality they're not. And so I'm going to break them down, and I may or may not upset some of you right now because you're like, wait, what? But we live with these misconceptions for a majority of our lives, and they are not supported at all by our communication model, what we know about communication, and our communication theories. So the first one is all communication seeks understanding. Boom, wrong. It does not. That is a misconception. That is a total myth. It is not true. The reason why it is not true is because not all communication seeks understanding. One great example I can give you is for any of you who have a job, have had a job, will get a job. When you go to work, you have to say hi to your coworkers. You have to greet them, right? It's a little rude just to come in, sit down, and not talk to anyone at all for the whole day. Also kind of almost impossible to do in certain situations. So when you say, hey, how's it going? Susie, what's happening? How are you? And Susie will say, I'm doing great. How are you? And then you're going to say, I'm doing great too. And then boom, your interaction is done and you go on. And you do this maybe 400 or 500 more times for the rest of your life. And even when you're not feeling great, you still say, oh, I'm doing good. I'm doing great, right? Because we all know at the end of the day, none of us wants to hear someone say, oh my God, my life is so hard. I'm so stressed out. I have all these exams. I have money problems and I'm so stressed out and I'm fighting with my boyfriend. No one wants to hear about all your problems, right? So even if you are having a bad day, or even if you're not feeling super well, just be like, oh yeah, I'm good. Cool, thanks for asking. That's a perfect example of how all communication does not seek understanding. We think that it does. We think that we're communicating with other people to try to seek some sort of understanding of a message from them. But in reality, we use communication just to maintain our social ties on a regular basis, right? We even get this when we go out to stores or restaurants. Sometimes if you are an employee there, I used to work in foods when I was in college, and so I would always ask customers, hey, how's it going? How are you? And they would say, great, how are you? And I would be like, yeah, I'm good. So that's just another example of how we have these rituals in societies where we ask people how they're doing, and we talk about our days, and it's not really a interaction that actually involves any understanding of the other person or any true meaning or message coming out of them. So we tend to think all communication seeks understanding, but in reality it doesn't. Communication is also majorly there just to prop up social rules and norms that we follow. Okay? The second one is that more communication is always better. Absolutely wrong. I love it when I hear couples kind of talk about when couples are fighting, the telltale sign that they're fighting is that they usually say something like this: we just need to communicate more. And I say, no, honey, you don't need to communicate more. You need to communicate better, right? You need to do what you're doing, but in a better way. You need to do it in a more efficient way. More communication is not always better. Take it from me. Sometimes I blather on in certain contexts and situations. I'm a super social person, and so because of that, I end up saying too much. If any of you out there, you feel me, holla, it's stressful, right? You have to kind of shut your mouth sometimes and not say a whole bunch of stuff. So just because you're communicating more with someone, that doesn't mean that it's better. What you should aspire to is more efficient, more competent communication, not just more communication. So oftentimes when I hear couples say, we'll be fine, we're fighting, but as long as we communicate more, we'll be fine. And usually I'm like, no, More communication will not fix your problem. If anything, it might hurt your problems because you might be fighting because your communication is so terrible. So why would you add more terrible communication? You want better communication, not more terrible communication. So don't always think that just because we're communicating more, that that's a better thing. Lastly, communication will solve all problems. No, it doesn't. If anything, it probably causes more problems than it solves, to be rather honest with you. Communication doesn't solve all problems. It's not an end-all, be-all. It's not something that will absolutely fix everything in your life. And that's unfortunate, and I wish it could. And I'm here to teach you skills that'll get you there, because communication is definitely the key to having successful, healthy, thriving relationships of any kind, but it doesn't always solve all problems. Case in point, you may exit this class being a wonderful, efficient, beautiful communicator who just knows how to manage conflict, who knows how to communicate with a wide variety of people, who's very skilled in their communication, and then you're gonna go get a job at a new place, and then you're gonna meet someone who's a terrible communicator. And you are gonna try your best to communicate with that person and have a healthy, thriving workplace relationship with them. But if they are a person who does not want to communicate with you, or does not communicate well with you, or that does not have communication skills, are you guys going to have problems? For sure. So just because you have really strong communication skills, that doesn't necessarily mean that it'll solve all your problems, because that other people might not have good communication skills, right? You can't really control what they do. You can only control what you do. And if you're hearing random noises in the background, that's my bulldog right now. Hey, 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 stop. I'm lecturing. That's rude. Thank you. See, struggles are real. Apologize. So the last one is that effective communication is a natural ability. It is definitely not a natural ability. There are people that are born with, let's say, really good public speaking skills, really good interpersonal skills, but those are still skills that have to be developed. So in the same way that an athlete might naturally be really good at playing basketball, he or she will still have to practice, right? They'll still have to learn how to play basketball every day and get better and better and better at it. So just because we may or may not be born with a tendency to be an effective communicator, that doesn't mean it's a natural ability that's just going to come out of us. It's a skill set that's really important. So how do we then become competent communicators? And that is our goal for this class, right? Let's talk about what competent communication is first. Let's define it. Communication competence, or being a competent communicator, means two things: that you are both effective and appropriate in a given situation. Now, I want to preface this by saying, I know these two words are very familiar to you because we use them a lot in everyday context. However, in the context of this class, treat them like vocabulary words. They actually have very heavy set meaning because they are the two components of what makes communication competent. Hint, hint, this might be on your exam. So please, please do not look at these words and be like, oh, I know what the word effective means, or I know what the word appropriate means. In this context, it means something slightly different. So effective communication refers to communication that gets your content across. Remember, we talked about how communication has a content and relational dimension. So effective communication is communication that effectively sends your content in the appropriate way. So if you are a boss and you need your employees to do something, and you kindly send out an email to everyone and you lay out very clearly the steps you want your employees to do, you are practicing effective communication. You are very clearly giving them instructions, and you're very clearly laying out your message so that everybody can understand it. However, just because a message is effective, that doesn't mean it's appropriate. What appropriate means is that it makes sense for the situation, right? So it might be appropriate to text your friend and say, hey, where do you want to have dinner tonight? But as we mentioned earlier, it's definitely not appropriate to text someone to break up with them, right? Not appropriate to use that kind of channel. So while being effective deals with the content dimension of the relationship, appropriate deals with the relational dimension of the relationship. Okay? So for example, let's say that you are going out to dinner with your friend. Very easy just to say, hey, John, ready to go? Let's go to dinner. What do you want to eat? Taco Bell? Yeah? That feel good? Good. And it's very appropriate for you to talk to your friend that way because they're your friends, right? It's a very casual relationship. However, let's say you're going out to dinner with your grandma. You would not talk to your grandma that way. So it is not appropriate for you to be like, yo, grandma, what do you want? Because that's just not a respectful way to talk to your grandma. So you might say, hey, grandma, what do you think? What do you feel like eating today? Here's some suggestions. What do you think so far? You're going to talk to your grandma in a very different way than you'll talk to your best friends. Right? So that is the difference between being effective and appropriate. Effective deals with that content dimension, whether something is appropriate deals with relational. And you need both in order to be considered a competent communicator, not just one or the other. Okay? There is no single or ideal or effective way to communicate. Students get really frustrated with me because they always want to say, well, what should I do to become a better communicator? And I give them a set of skills that they need to develop, and then they're like, okay, but just tell me what to say. And I can't do that because every single person, as we learned from the transactional communication model, has a different environment, has a different perception, and every single interaction is unique and different in and of itself. And so there's no single ideal or effective way to communicate because it really just depends upon the context that you're in, the person that you're speaking with. Hey, puppies. Sorry, my puppies are. Hey, knock it off. Stop, please. Thank you. I'm lecturing. I apologize. So there is no single ideal or effective way to communicate because everybody is different, right? One of my closest friends is an introvert, for example, and I can't really tell her to communicate the way that I communicate because that's not who she is, right? She's very introverted, and so I can't really prescribe to her my set of skills because it doesn't quite translate to someone who's introverted, whereas I'm very extroverted. The second and third one is that competence is situational, as I talked about. It very much depends on the situation. I have a very close girlfriend of mine who is a successful business owner, and she is such a good business owner. She is very, very strong as a leader and both as a boss at her work and as an owner of her business as well. And one of the coolest things about her, I find is that she leads by example, and she does so well in the workplace, communicating with her employees, communicating with those around her, communicating in any different aspect about her business. However, she struggles a lot with her family communication. And so while she's very competent in her work environment, she's not as competent in the situation of her family environment because she doesn't quite know how to communicate with her family yet. She tries to take the same skills that she uses in her workplace and translates it to her family life, which we all know from our transactional communication model, you can't do that. And so you may be a competent communicator in one situation, and not be that great in another situation. Competence can also be learned, though, so it's not a total loss. It's not something that I'm going to suck forever at communication. That's definitely not the case. You can definitely become a really great communicator by developing the skills over time. It's super important to remember that as well. So, what are the characteristics of a competent communicator? So even though every single situation is different and every person is different, and I can't really prescribe this is the way to be a good communicator, we do know that these are the bare minimum set of skills you need to become a competent communicator. One of those is a large repertoire of skills. What that means is that you need to be able to interact with people in a lot of different ways, using humor, being serious. You have to be able to have a wide variety of skills and a wide variety of experiences in order to be successful. you have to adapt, right? So let's say that in a job interview, someone gives you a question and you just knock it out of the park. You're so good and you're doing very well in that job interview, and then suddenly they ask you a very tough question and you have no idea how to answer it. And so, one second, I'm sorry. And so what do you do in that given situation? You may start to sweat, you might start to blush, you might start to panic. And so a competent communicator will try to have those nonverbal signs of stress under control and still be able to deliver somewhat of a decent message or a decent answer to that question, regardless of whether or not that question is really tough. Let me fix that. I'm sorry. Is this better or worse? I hope that fixes it. I'm sorry. I was not watching the chat. I was so busy, chatting. That's worse? Okay. That's worse. Okay. Let's fix them. Is that better or is that worse? Anyone? Better? Worse? Better or worse right now? Sorry about that, guys. It's about the same? Okay. Un momento. Let me take a look at this. It's the same. Okay. How do I sound now? Does that sound better? I switched my microphone off. Does that sound good? Sound okay now? I still sound the same? I'm just gonna wait. I think there's a little bit of a delay. Let me fix that. Is that better now? Oh, much better. Thank you. Okay. Whew. All right. All right. Sorry about that, guys. I had no idea that was happening. I was not watching the chat. I was so excited with lecturing and then also trying to keep my dogs calm. All right. So, Stephanie, do you still hear static right now, or is it okay now? It's perfect. All right. Sorry about that. Oh man, I had you sit through that whole lecture. I'm sorry. I will record a new lecture if I can. I'll go back and hear how terrible it was. My bad. Sorry. Where was I? All right. So, ability to perform skillfully, as I am not doing right now, and being a good role model for you all. Involvement is a big part of competent communication, meaning that you have to be able to integrate yourself into the interaction. And the biggest way to integrate yourself into any given interaction is through empathy and perspective taking. What that means is that you have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the other person. And I know that we throw the word empathy around very often in our everyday interactions. In the context of communication studies, what empathy truly means is that you try your absolute best to find a piece of yourself in the other person's experience. One example I can give you is that I am a huge dog lover. If you guys will soon figure this out, I love my dogs and I love dogs in general. I'm a huge animal advocate. But dogs are absolutely my favorite. I just love dogs. Every time I see a dog on the street, I'm like, I need to pet that dog. I love dogs. I hate cats. I'm sorry for my people that love cats. I don't know why. I just had a bad experience as a child and I don't like cats. But one of my girlfriends, her cat recently passed away. And I didn't really like the cat and the cat didn't like me. So I wasn't super devastated. That sounds terrible. But I wasn't distraught emotionally at the death of this cat. But I know that my friend was. And I came over to her house to try to cheer her up because I knew that she was not, obviously doing well because her cat had passed away. And I didn't want to say cliche things like, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss, or she's in a better place. I didn't want to say cliche things like that because my girlfriend and I have been through a lot together, and so I wanted to show her that I'm here for her and I understand her pain. And so one of the things I did was I did a mental exercise where I tried to perspective take and practice empathy with her. So I tried to think, she lost her cat. And she loved her cat the same way I love my dog, Loki. what would happen or how would I feel if my dog passed away? And in that moment, I started feeling true empathy for her. I started feeling and understanding a little, just the tiniest bit of what she must be going through right now after the loss of her cat. And so that is what true empathy is. Empathy isn't, oh, that sucks, I feel bad for you, pat on the shoulder. Empathy is going there with that other person, going deep down into the emotion that they're feeling and finding a piece of yourself that connects with them, even if it's an experience that you don't know. So for example, I don't have a cat, I don't like cats, and my dog that I have right now is the very first dog I've ever had. So I've actually never experienced the loss of a pet before. And so I was worried that I couldn't support her well because I have no idea what she's going through. But imagining just for a second, if I had lost my dog, made me empathetic enough to be able to support her in that moment in a true and authentic way. So that is what true empathy is. The second to last one is cognitive complexity. What that means is that to be a competent communicator, that means that you have to be able to think in complex ways. Your English teacher, for example, has probably encouraged you to be a critical thinker. This is very, very similar. It's a similar concept. It just means that you're able to see different perspectives and understand different perspectives all at the same time. And that can be really hard because you have to pull yourself out of your own world and your own bubble and try to understand the worlds and bubbles of other people. And that can be really challenging. And so you want to practice cognitive complexity. You want to practice a mind that can wrap itself around someone else's perspective and someone else's world. And that really sets you up to be a successful and competent communicator, because when you know what someone else is saying to you and you understand where they're coming from, you can better provide feedback and respond to their message. Remember, in the transactional communication model, it's two ways, right? So when that person is talking, you're listening and you're assigning meaning to what they're saying. If you practice cognitive complexity, you can more accurately assign meaning to what they're saying. If you don't have cognitive complexity, it might be really difficult for you to assign meaning to what they're saying because you just don't have that cognitive complexity to fully understand their worldview because it may be so different from yours. The last one is self-monitoring, and I know that for me, this is definitely one of the more difficult skills to practice because, like I said, I'm very social. I love to chat. I love to talk. And so because of that, I have to self-monitor and make sure that I don't interrupt people or that I don't dominate a conversation or that I'm listening actively when the other person is talking. And all of us have different weaknesses in our communication repertoire, our communication skills. So for some of you, listening might be a strength, but speaking might be a weakness or vice versa. And so self-monitoring is really important because it is a practice of being self-aware of what you're doing right now. One of the things that I think is really important in self-monitoring, for example, is listening. When we listen, sometimes we're tired from work or school, or we're just exhausted and our significant other is telling us about their day, right? We might listen mindlessly and be like, yeah, blah, blah. And if we just might not be really listening to them at all, right? Which will affect our relationship because people catch on to that. They'll be like, hey, are you really paying attention to me right now? Are you really listening to me? Are you just ignoring me or just saying, yeah, just cause? And we've all been a victim of someone who pretended to listen to us but really didn't, and that hurts, right? So if we practice self-monitoring, we know, okay, wait, well, I need to start paying attention. I need to listen. I'm definitely not listening actively right now, so maybe I need to sit up more. Maybe I need to drink some water. Maybe I need to give that person more eye contact. Self-monitoring just means that you're more aware of what you're doing and what your needs are so that you can better respond to the other person and the situation at hand. Super important. In communication interactions, sometimes we get so wrapped up in paying attention to the other person that we forget about paying attention to us, right? We forget about how important it is for us to know how we're feeling right now and what we're doing and how we're contributing to the interaction. Very important. So, next. One quick thing I want to mention, and that your textbook also mentions as well, is that when you try, this is why I put an arrow here, when you try to translate these skills to social media, they don't always translate well. For any of you who have social media accounts, I'm not a super heavy Facebook user, but I love Instagram because I love to look at pictures of dogs. Love dogs. One of the biggest things about social media is that there's leanness and asynchronicity, meaning that social media tends to be lean in its message, meaning that messages tend to be shorter. Even when we text, right, we text with shorter words or shorter messages than we would normally do face to face. And it's also asynchronous. There's asynchronicity, meaning that once we put a message somewhere, we comment on someone's Instagram photo, we comment on a YouTube thing, or we send an email, we don't get feedback right away. So it kind of kills the transactional communication model because, well, I just wrote that email, now I just got to sit here, right, and wait for that person's response, which might not be for a while. And even then, their response might be heavily affected because when they're reading your email, they have time to respond to it, right? It's very different when someone asks you a question face to face and you have to respond right away versus someone texting you and then you have time to respond later. And so the asynchronous nature, meaning that it's not synced up, it's not message feedback as it would face to face in social media, because we lack that, it really affects how we develop our communication skills, because now we're adding this additional layer to our communication that we didn't have to really think of before. A lot of you have done this maybe when you're dating someone. I hear this as an example a lot from my students when they text someone and they say, hey, do you want to hang out? And you were texting back and forth, and then suddenly when you ask them, hey, you want to hang out, they just like don't respond for like 5 hours. And you're like, what? Like, I was just texting you like earlier today, and then I asked you if you want to hang out, and then I don't hear from you for like a day. And then later they're like, oh, I didn't check this message till later. You don't need that nonsense in your life, people. Get out of there. But we see that even with just texting, again, going back to how important channels are, how asynchronous the nature of social media, it really makes our communication much more difficult, because now that person has time to think about their answer. Like, do I want to say yes? Do I want to say no? If I say no, how will I say it? When do I text back? When do I not? And then you're on the other end of that phone like, oh my God, just answer me. And it really affects your relationship overall, because you're over there stressed out. Like, why isn't that person responding to me? That person over there isn't quite sure if they want to hang out with you or not, or if they do, they don't, There's a lot of crazy stuff that goes on in social media through text because of that asynchronous nature. And it's also permanent. What is on social media or what is on the internet stays there forever. And I'm sure you guys have heard that before. And people tend to not take that a lot very seriously, but I think it's very important. When you post on someone's wall, when you post a comment, even if you delete it afterwards, you have no idea if it still exists somewhere, because people can screenshot it, people can save it, people can copy paste it and send it to someone else. And so whatever you put on the media is on the internet or social media is permanent, unlike face-to-face communication, where you might forget what someone verbally said to you word for word later, in the day. But if I type something to you, either through text, through email, on your Facebook wall, on your Instagram, it's permanent, right? It's there forever. And Snapchat is dying now, but one example that a student gave me of the permanence of social media was that in Snapchat, a lot of people tended to think that if I sent someone a snap, that it would disappear right after I send it to them. For those of you who aren't familiar with Snapchat, you can send snaps or like video or images as messages to people, and those messages only play for 13 seconds, I believe, 13 to 20 seconds, and then they disappear, and the person can't save them anywhere. That's not true, because she told me that if you put your phone on airplane mode and you screenshot that person's snap, you can actually save their snap and you will never be notified that it got screenshot. So have your wits about you, people. It's always permanent. Be careful what you put on the internet, all right? So With that being said, let us wrap up our lecture. I know this is tons of information, but we are going to go ahead and finish up so I can make sure to address any questions that you have later. But really, the biggest things I want you to take away from this chapter is our transactional communication model and how important it is. Those 4 insights that we learned. We learned about the needs that communication addresses. So we have 4 major needs as human beings, and communication addresses all of those. We learned about the principles of competent communication and how important it is to be both effective and appropriate in a given situation. We learned about the content and relational dimension of all messages. And finally, we also learned about how that plays out a little bit in social media and the different issues that come along with that. The biggest thing that I want you to take away from this chapter is